Today's episode of Socially Democratic is now available on Patreon. Join our Socially Democratic community on Patreon for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show. And when you sign up as a campaign organizer, you get access to our premium episodes, a free ticket to a live show, and Haters Gonna Hate and the Rest Vote Labor merch. And when you have signed up, please check your inboxes from a message from our producer because we need your shipping addresses so we can send out the merch to you. Today's episode is also brought to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place, develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Marshall Gantz framework of leadership, organising and action. And if you want to create action in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years and have helped more than 500,000 people get compensation they deserved. And if you've been injured at work or on the road, then you may have a claim through your super. And for expert and empathetic legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And obviously today is our second of our 4-part US presidential election weekly recap with Ross Morales-Rochetto and Katie Parsons. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. And also for everything in terms of following us on social media, follow Socially Democratic on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, but it's Tuesday afternoon US time, and that means it's exactly 12 days out from Election Day in the race for the White House. And to help me recap the past 7 days of this presidential campaign, I'm once again, for week 2, joined by our 2 regular special guests. She's the senior VP at a leading Democratic consulting firm, and I think she should have a spin-off podcast called the Katie Parsons Project. Katie Parsons, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks. Good to be back.
And he's the co-founder for Run for Something and White Dudes for Harris, a native Texan, Ross Morales-Rochetto, arguably one of the best names in Democratic politics. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me. And I was also just talking to my wife a couple of days ago about how I feel like Australia and like Texas like have some sort of kinship. I don't totally know how or why, but like I feel like also like whatever Texas is to the United States, Australia is to the rest of the world. That I don't have a good explanation for it, but it's something that I feel, and it's the vibes election, so we're going with it.
Radio. We think that in Australia we often try to do the which Australian state replicates like a US state. My home state of Victoria, a lot of people say it's like Massachusetts. In fact, Melbourne and Boston are both sister cities, large Irish population, all that kind of stuff. Texas and Western Australia, both big geographical states and both built on mining and also have a separatist movement. Western Australians only joined the Australian Federation when we promised them we would build them a railroad connecting the East Coast to the West Coast, and they said yes. All right, we'll become a part of Australia.
Seems
nothing like a good bribe. Yeah, nothing like a good bribe.
Yeah, exactly. So if you ever come out to Australia, Ross, I encourage you to go to Perth. I don't normally say that to people at all, but here you go. I'm now saying it on a podcast. Go to Perth. Katie, I've got Illinois. I don't know what Illinois is in Australia. It's just, I have never thought about that one. Illinois.
Do you have a Midwest? I mean, the land of
South Australia is kind of the polite state.
Mm-hmm.
But there are elements of, I could do a whole podcast on this. There are elements of South Australia that's kind of a little bit Pennsylvania but also a little bit Vermonty as well. They're free settlers. There's a lot of Germans there. This is South Australia I'm talking about. Yeah. High murder capital. That's also weird about South Australia. Anyway, you don't want to be South Australia. That's the takeaway for Illinois. Right, let's get into today's episode. And I say that as I lived there for 5 years, so don't pick on me, South Australian listeners. I paid your taxes. Okay, let's start with before we do our weekly recap, swag. What swag have we got today and with a little bit of a backstory? I can only lead off with mine is for those watching on YouTube. I've got my Obama with the Obama, and it says Asphaedra Lynn, which is Irish for yes, we can. And I'm just trying to bring the good positive vibes for this particular campaign that, yes, we can do this as well. That is I don't even know where I got this t-shirt. There's no backstory to it other than that, just, my own ethnic background. Katie, to you, first of all, what swag are you wearing today that you want to talk about in terms of past campaigns?
Yeah. Visually very uninteresting, a Repower America t-shirt, but I was thinking about this earlier this week because all of these stories about Trump's that's a new one. Trump's paid canvassing fails, which we'll talk about more later, but just had me reminiscing on my days back when I worked for Repower America, which was a big campaign in the early Obama years, trying to pass climate legislation. We were kind of like the number 2 after healthcare. Didn't quite make it, obviously, but it was a massive effort. And one of my jobs was to manage all of the paid canvas vendors. And the thing is that, paid canvas vendors, you gotta account for a certain amount of fibbing with the numbers and things like that. And back in those days, we had a program going in Indiana, which I think I've mentioned before. That's where my parents live. So I was living in DC. One of the paid canvas vendors kept telling me, man, we haven't collected this X number of letters that we need to do. They just couldn't get the numbers there. But I was back home anyway in Indiana, and this is where they were canvassing. And I said, I'm going to go to the office and count myself. And it took me an hour and a half to count. They had everything that they needed already there. They didn't need any extra time to do the work. And if somebody on their team had just taken the time to count the stuff in the office, 2 weeks of back and forth would have been completely unnecessary. But I think that's highly emblematic of the experience of working with paid canvas vendors, but you got to have them. This is not to slight them. It's just to be realistic about the nature of the beast
and their expectations. Very good. Ross, what do you got for us today?
I'm not wearing it because I have a man bun and so I don't wear hats, but I do have my White Dudes for Harris camo hat, which just came in not too long ago. And I'm the lead organizer for White Dudes for Harris. So here we go. I don't have a cool story. Well, we did an entire episode on the story about White Dudes for Harris. So already on this podcast, so we don't need to do it again. But yeah, it's been a hell of a ride, and it's basically basically a full-time job for the next 2, as we close out the election the next 2 weeks. So here we go. And later tonight, I have an organizing call. I don't know why I agreed to basically pick 2 things on a weekly basis on Tuesday nights where I needed to be totally 100% on. And so I basically have 3 hours of things where I'm on camera, and then finally wrap up at 9 p.m. in the evening. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, but when I was scheduling, I guess I decided that was the right thing for me to do. So here we are.
Well, we're glad you're here, and smart that you've chosen us first so we don't get you tired at the end, as opposed to the other way around. So we're appreciative of that. Let's jump right into the top stories that have come out of the States in the last 7 days. The things that I wanted to talk about are Vice President Harris appearing on Fox, and Trump doing a whole bunch of different town halls, Trump working at McDonald's for 15 minutes. Early voting's begun. Is there enthusiasm? And then we're going to talk a little bit about polls because we missed that last week. Let's start off with Vice President Harris appearing on Fox with a sit-down interview with Brett Baer? How do you pronounce that surname? Bear? Anyway, no one knows because no one watches Fox, but Republicans do. And so this was a big thing for, thanks for the help, team. This was a big thing for Vice President Harris and for a Democratic nominee to go into the lion's den. And I think it was a smart thing to do. It was a very adversarial, as we would have expected, interview. I thought she held her own admirably well and really pushed back in aspects of it. Katie, to you first of all, if you're the campaign manager for Harris, do you agree to this? Do you do the Trump? There's a Freudian slip. The Fox News interview.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of what she's been trying to do is grab oxygen, break through, be the story in a way that's been difficult since we've gotten through all of the main fixtures of the campaign, right? They aren't doing any other debates. So I think this was a good way to get in the news. And clearly she was well prepared and they felt confident that she could show up and be adversarial and hold her own. And so I think when you have a candidate who can do that, it's a smart decision. It's also my favorite sort of interpretation of this that I've heard, and I don't remember who said this, but maybe she's not convincing the everybody who's watching it, but there are some wives who are, their husband are listening to Fox News 24/7, and maybe we catch their ears, and women vote. So I think there's very little downside, basically.
Ross, when you watched, did you get a chance to get any of the clips of it all?
Yeah.
How did you think she performed in the actual interview? Because tough ask, right?
I think that there's always, there's always a risk in sending a candidate into like an adversarial situation. I think this type of situation lent itself really well. And I think we talked about this like a little bit last week, but like it lent itself well to what she needs to do. And so like there's plenty of polling out there that demonstrates that like she needs to like show strength and that she can stand up to, world dictators, and that she's going to be an independent actor. And is some of this like rooted in like the fact that she's a Black woman? Like, yes, it absolutely is. And also it's like what voters are saying. It is also what voters are saying in the polling. And so I think this was a smart strategic move to put her like on Fox with someone that they knew was going to be adversarial, but was not the most adversarial of like all of the folks that they could have chosen. Somebody who like would mostly stay in bounds. And I think she did a really good job, and I think she was prepared for it. I think they did a good job of anticipating the types of questions that they were going to get. And they also like they prepped her in such a way that allowed her to be her, and almost treat it like she was like cross-examining a witness. And I think the more they can put her in opportunity, that's why the debate was really good for her. The more they can put her in situations like that, and the more they can set up interviews in ways that like really fit with the way that she sort of like operates best, I think the better. And I think I think maybe last week I pushed back on the idea that this is a brand new campaign. It is not a brand new campaign. She inherited the Biden campaign infrastructure, but the campaign is getting used to her as a candidate. And I think that sometimes takes a little bit of time. Like they had Joe Biden. He was the candidate for the first 6 months of the campaign. Now they have this other person. She has different strengths. She has different weaknesses. And so I think they're really starting to learn what her strengths and weaknesses are, and like where she really excels, and like where like maybe they shouldn't be sending her. Like you're noticing like they don't send her a ton to like normal 60 minutes type sit down interviews. It's like not what they're doing with her. They're sending her to like Charlemagne. They're sending her on Fox News. It sounds like she's probably, there are negotiations around Joe Rogan. Like they're sending her to sort of like more non-traditional like places. And I think those suit her a little bit better than like the traditional sit down interview that you might see with like like another presidential candidate like Joe Biden.
It's interesting. I just read the papers this morning that Donald Trump is going to appear on Joe Rogan, and it's been confirmed. So I'm wondering if Vice President Harris does.
There's been
the same.
reports that they're in negotiations with them around it. I don't think it's been confirmed though.
Right. Speaking of going into unfamiliar terrain, Donald Trump visited McDonald's probably for the first time in his entire life, which is funny given that he eats so much of it, but I'm sure he gets others to collect that food for him. It was 15 minutes in a McDonald's store. The entire store was closed down for the entire day. There were no workers or customers in there. He served food out the drive-through window to a Trump supporter who walked up the driveway of the drive-through. The only person I've ever known to actually collect McDonald's from a drive-through window walking was me, drunk one night at the Bell Street Macca's when I was in college, pretending that I was a car. Now, so this is unusual for this to happen. So let's not pretend that this was just Donald Trump rocking up to a regular Macca's. Sorry, in Australia we call McDonald's Macca's. I should point that out to our American listeners. To a regular McDonald's or a regular Macca's, it was empty. So it was a complete stump and a setup. Obviously, Donald Trump is looking to be seen as an everyday man, and I'm assuming this is a pitch to, quote unquote, working class, blue collar voters in those battleground states. Katie, what was your takeaway from Donald Trump visiting at McDonald's?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I think it was less of a disaster than is being for him than is being reported in left-leaning circles. I think there are a couple ways it's interesting to see how he's messaging it, more towards his base. They're using this as an opportunity to essentially redo the, just like they did with Barack Obama saying he was born in Kenya, the whole birther thing, attacking, something that's sort of central to a person's biography. So Kamala Harris famously has said that she worked at McDonald's when she was a college student over the summer when she was at Howard, but this was back when she was in California, I guess. And he's with no reason or evidence to the contrary, he's essentially just claiming that wasn't true. And so the way that he's talking about it to his people is to, they keep saying, oh, he's trolling Kamala, which is a great way to rile up his base. For undecided folks, exactly like you said, it's a way for him to try to present himself as a man for the working class. I think the interesting thing for us is it tees up actually a great contrast for us on a couple of things. Like he said repeatedly that he either doesn't support a minimum wage or certainly wouldn't raise it, where there's kind of no more quintessential minimum wage job than McDonald's. And so it makes it really easy for us to raise this, okay, you've heard lots of he's cosplaying working class, and in contrast to us who are we actually have policies to support the people who work at McDonald's or other people who make a minimum wage. So it's I don't see it as a loser for him yet, but it's kind of an interesting choice.
He was asked by a journalist, do you support raising the minimum wage to $15? And he just gave an absolute bullshit answer and didn't answer it, and just sort of said, this is, it's a great franchise and there are great people at work here. Like it was an absolute just dodge.
Yeah.
Ross, are you overwhelmed by one of the presidential candidates going and making fries in a McDonald's for 15 minutes?
No, I think this is one of those election cycles where the result can hinge on 100 different factors, and we have no idea what those are. None. We have zero idea what any of them are going to be. And so more is more, and throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks is probably smart. I agree with Katie. I don't think it was a disaster for him. I think it was fine. my hunch is it appealed to his base. My hunch is it doesn't do that much to move undecided voters, however many of them there really actually are. We'll probably talk about that at some point. But yeah, I think overall, no pun intended, it was probably a nothing burger.
Very good. Polling. We didn't talk about polling. I want to talk about it this week. And there's so much to talk about. You can almost do a whole episode on this. Just to give folks an overview, the national poll average, and these figures are based on the work done on the New York Times. The national poll average has Vice President Harris on 49 points, Trump on 48. If you then go to the state level polls across those 7 key battleground states, Trump leads by less than 1% in North Carolina, leads by more than 2 points in Georgia, and by more than 2 points in Arizona. Vice President Harris leads Trump by less than a point in Michigan, less than a point in Pennsylvania, less than a point in Nevada, and less than a point in Wisconsin. Now, these are aggregators, okay? So in amongst all of that, they're averaging out every poll that happens, and they weight some because obviously there are Democratic pollsters that release public polls and there are Republican pollsters that release public polls. And so they try and weight that to give you an overall sample that is a reflection of the electorate. But, first takeaway, it's super, super close. And I guess the thing that I keep on asking myself is, how accurate are these polls? And I guess that's what we're all asking ourselves. They were, in 2016, they were completely, the national average was pretty much spot on, or was out by a point, but the state level polling was way out. And so that kind of threw us all. In 2020, it oversampled Democrat voters. So this is the Biden-Trump presidential election. It oversampled the Democrat vote on average by about 4 points, I think. And in the end, it came into the Joe Biden won by around about a point, and that's it. That was translated even to those battleground state races, like for example, Pennsylvania. However, in the 2020 midterms, they sought to correct that and then oversampled Republicans, and everyone said there's going to be a red wave, and it didn't happen, as we know, and it turned out to be a good result for Democrats. So the question I'm asking myself is, have they got this sampling right? Because that was the big challenge, is they weren't getting enough non-college educated white Republican voters. They were sampling, they thought they had enough Republicans in the sample, but they were missing out on this education balance. And so we're being assured by all the pollsters, no, we've corrected that. So maybe these polls are spot on. Maybe it is just super, super close. But if it's not, then we're in for a shock or a surprise on election night. To you, first of all, Katie, your initial reflections of the polling, and why have they been so tight for so long, do you think?
Why they've been so tight for so long, we don't know yet. I think we won't know until the election. We won't be able to say that with any certainty. I mean, they're tight because that's what they're getting in their sample. But I think, in 2022, the most recent election, just like you said, there was this big red wave predicted. Part of that, though certainly not the only part, was that the Republicans released like a ton of essentially junk polls. They're inside polls. They're polls that you release in order to drive the story. You want to say Republicans are ahead because you have a belief in bandwagon effect, that if Republicans believe that other Republicans are getting out and voting, that more of them will do the same. So they did a lot of that and ended up not being the case on the night. But I think we still don't know if they have the sample right, particularly around it. Now it's no longer just non-college educated white men. It's sort of non-college educated in general. They've decided is now kind of the biggest indicator of how somebody is going to vote on election day. It's no longer age, less. It's less race than it used to be. As it evens out. But the one other really interesting thing that I was reading, in order to counterbalance this, a lot of the pollsters have now started benchmarking against 2020 results. So they're asking people, how did you vote in 2020? Or they're looking at if it's like a panel or something like that, where they had asked folks in 2020 and they're asking them again. They're using that to weight the results. And the effect of that is that it tries to make this year's polling numbers look a little bit closer to 2020. And it's a big question. Maybe that's going to be effective, or maybe this election really is different enough. If I were arguing that that's the case, I would say it's because of abortion again, and that they've mobilized unintentionally, that Republicans have mobilized women and others who prioritize abortion to go and vote the way that they did in 2022. So I think, Ross, you said last week, like, it's really a Rorschach test. How do you want to read it? That's what it's going to be. We're in a statistical tie in every single one of those states. I would always rather see Harris, up 1 point than down 1 point, but it's essentially the exact same thing. It's pretty meaningless. So I don't have any kind of gut feeling about it, because it doesn't really mean anything.
Ross, one thing I do is like, then I'll click in and look at all of the samples that are in there, and I'm so biased. I'm going, I'm discounting that one completely. That's ridiculous. Like, it'll be like, Trafalgar Group, Trump +3. Nah, yeah, you're a Republican poster. I'm counting that one. And they'll go like Morning Consult, Harris take +1. All right, I'll take that. Or the Washington Post, George Mason University poll, Harris +2. Yeah, that sounds reasonable. That's good to me. But obviously, we can't do that. I mean, that's ridiculous. But how are you rationalizing what's going on in the polls right now, Ross?
The only time I look at polls is when I'm prepping for these episodes. I'm not looking at them right now. I'm not looking at 538. I literally pulled up 538 because I'm going to be talking about Wisconsin in a little bit. And I was doing some research on sort of where the polls are in Wisconsin, but I kind of already knew where the polls were in Wisconsin. And to be honest, like, I kind of knew what the dynamic was before I looked, which is, the Senate race is outperforming the presidential by a little bit. And the presidential polls are basically show a dead heat. And I think that many things can be true at once, which is the polls are really close, and maybe the pollsters are capturing what's really happening. Maybe they're not. To be honest, if I were to bet, no, they're not. Like, if I were going to put money on it, I would put money that they're somehow over or undersampling somebody. And Katie, I think you were talking last week about how folks were like undersampling like women, how the pollsters are probably undersampling women because of like the abortion issue. And so like that feels super reasonable to me. And that can be true. And the fact that this is a razor thin election can also be true at the same time. I think like at the end of the day, it's all going to be about making sure this is, I don't think this is a persuasion election. I think this is a turnout election. I think whoever gets more of their people out is going to win. And I know we'll talk about some of this later. And I think that's why you see the campaigns each really digging in on their strategies right now. You're not seeing strategy shifts. You're seeing doubling down on strategy, for better or worse, when we'll find out on election night if it was for better or worse on either side.
We talked about this last week, and you just mentioned there, Ross, that we don't think there is a lot of folks who are still left to be persuaded, and that this is a turnout election. There was an interesting article during the week, and there was a bunch of numbers that fell out of this one in terms of who is likely persuadable in this campaign at this point in time. That Siena College New York Times poll found a mere 3.7%, or about 1.2 million voters, were still truly undecided out of likely voters. The Trump campaign had given some background and said that their model in their battleground states found that 5% of voters were still undecided. And they said that they were racially diverse people with lower incomes and tend to use streaming service and social media. The Harris campaign, a little bit more optimistic in terms of their winnable groups. They said about 10% of voters in battleground states were still undecided. So, there's
It depends on how you cut. It depends on how you think about your universe of voters. So like I would say the Harris campaign probably has a larger universe of voters than the Trump campaign does, for example, because because Democrats are like traditionally are trying to turn out lower propensity voters that are just like harder to get to vote. And so like it makes sense to me that like in the Harris campaign is going to have a bigger number or a larger number of persuadable voters than the Trump campaign, who has he has a very narrow path to victory. He has a solidly 50-50 chance of getting there, but his path is extremely narrow. It goes through an extremely narrow demographic. And, that's the downside for him. The downside for us is like we have a broader path, but the execution of that path is much harder. It is harder to get low propensity people out to vote than it is to get regular voters out to vote. And that's traditionally sort of how it breaks down Democrat, Republican. I think the Trump campaign is trying to we'll talk about this a little later, is trying to turn out low propensity men. And I agree that they're trying to turn out low propensity men who are of a diverse racial and socioeconomic groups. I believe that is what they're actually trying to do. So yeah, I think none of that from the story is super shocking, and I just the number of persuadable voters depends on what you think a voter is.
I mean, the commentary from that article had said that the area where the Harris campaign trying to, I guess, expand that universe that you're talking about, Trump, was particularly educated women voters in suburban areas that had historically voted Republican but are turned off by Trump. And I guess it's, what I'd heard from the 2020 campaign was that there was a lot of women that were sort of identified as Reagan type Republicans in suburban areas of Georgia, like Fulton County and Gwinnett County, and that had historically voted Republican. But on this occasion, they were like, no, I'm just turned off by Trump, and they voted Democratic. And obviously the Democrats are seeking to try and really move into that space in wherever that's replicated across all those battleground races. So we will see. Okay, let's move to Insider Baseball Talk, brought to you by Sam Adams Beer, the beer of champions. Speaking of beer of champions and champions, and if you want to win a championship, you need to moneyball things. Katie, your reflections from what are we seeing internally within these campaigns? I'm interested.
Yeah, you shared a story with us earlier about just the amount of money that our side, the Democrats, are putting into testing and researching their ads before they go up. And essentially this is all run through the largest PAC that's on the Democratic side. They have $700 million that they've raised, which is, a pretty astronomical sum, particularly for an outside effort. But and they are putting a lot of that behind ads. And the thing that a couple of things that they're doing that are a little unusual this time. One is they are holding a lot of that budget. So they bought up a bunch of ad time early. Earlier this year, they went to the networks and said, we want to buy up ad time just for this period, get out the vote period as we get closer to the election day. So they bought in advance with the idea to spend all of that money at the end. And they are basically putting, I think in the article it says it's like the Hunger Games, different people who create ads are submitting them, and then they're testing the ads to see which one works best before deciding how to move ahead. And of course, we've always tested ads, particularly at the presidential level, where you've got the budget to do that, and that's the right thing to do. But this degree of testing is pretty unprecedented for Democrats, and I think there's some question of, is this the right strategy, right? And I think we'll see on election day. But I have a couple thoughts just about the pros and cons of that. I think on the one hand, they're able to control. So there's been a lot of discussion about the backlash effect of ads. So we've seen in testing that sometimes an organization will put out an ad, let's say, don't vote for Donald Trump, he's a crazy clown, or something like that, right? There's a certain group of people who are going to agree with the ad. It's going to resonate with them. Maybe that's the thing that persuades them. But maybe there's just as many people or more who see that ad and they're totally turned off. And so you've lost their vote, or mobilized the other side more than you've done to actually win to your side. And so I know that they're paying a lot of attention to the potential backlash effect. And I think, on the one hand, when I've talked to folks about this, I think there can be too much attention to that, because you never know what is the tipping point moment when somebody makes a decision, right? If you just think about in your own life, big decisions that you've made, you may be able to identify, this is the moment, this is the thing that maybe decide a certain way. But that usually is after a whole series of previous maybe conversations. If it's a purchasing decision, you've probably seen a bunch of ads before you get to the moment, where you're finally deciding. So it's not always just about that one ad. And so I think the same thing with the backlash effect. Maybe it's a big turnoff, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to see other messages and things like that. So that's the one thing that kind of worries me about the focus on backlash. So on the positive side, though, we are so polarized this cycle. And I think often on our side, we're not great at understanding or even imagining what somebody who is a Republican or a more conservative independent, we just don't imagine the world the way that they do. And so sometimes we'll put together a message that to us seems totally right on. There's nothing that could be reproachable about that, and actually it's not working for us. So I think if there ever was a time to think about it, now is that moment. So we'll kind of see. The one other just like pro con thing that I'm weighing in my mind about this is the whether it's right to put so much money at the very end rather than spending more in the lead up to election day, over the course of the summer and all of this. And when we did, I worked on a big postmortem of the 2020 cycle last time around. And one of the things that we saw that was most effective, now this is down ballot, it wasn't at the presidential level, but the folks who went earliest did best, almost universally. Now, that may be correlation and not causation, right? Like if you went early, it's probably because you had a better campaign apparatus. Maybe you had done research earlier. So I don't want to say it's because they went earlier, but it worked for them. It was a good indicator. One of the other terms that the researchers are focused on here is the diminishing returns of an ad. So they have this belief that, if maybe you see an ad that really changed your mind or did a lot of work for us, but like after 3 days, it's no longer effective. So let's swamp the field in the last couple of days so that the effects of the message are the most powerful. Okay, totally get that. But like there's a message war happening for the whole course of the summer. There are other people dominating the news cycle and driving the message. And if we're not out there spending money to control what people are talking about and to make our case, somebody else is doing that. So I don't know if that's the right solution. I think the one thing that relaxes me a little bit about that is that there are so many players, right? So this is one PAC, and this is how they're spending their money. There are 37 other organizations and the actual campaign who are spending money in different ways. They are going earlier. They are putting out ads probably with less testing, for better or worse. And so, it's one part of the mix. If nothing else, we're going to get great data from the research that they're doing at the end of this that hopefully the whole movement will learn from. But I don't know yet if we can say whether it's a great thing or terrible thing, or frankly doesn't matter.
I mean, certainly in amongst a far more fragmented media market where we're getting our news from so many different other platforms than we were 10, 15 years ago. Certainly the theory here in Australia is in a persuasion type election campaign is that your big announcements that you want to embed in the minds of voters, you need to drop them months and months and months and months out from the election. So you have the time to get that, so people can understand what the message, what the announcement is, or what the policy is through all of those different channels. It takes time, and if you were going to drop a huge big announcement like you were going to fund, parental leave for parents or free kinder or something like that, you're not going to drop that now, 12 days out from the election campaign. It's just people won't find out about it. And certainly anecdotally, reading from I watched a college football game over the weekend through, but like Ross had been doing, I'd selected one of the local channels, and yes, it was the game in Georgia, and it was just nonstop ad after ad after ad after ad. And I'm like, people will just switch off on this. Like, they're not even going to pay attention to this sort of shit anymore because it was overwhelming, And I'm in politics. So I just think that, anyway, it's fascinating stuff. What you've talked about.
That wasn't a good game.
No, it was a terrible game.
As a University of Texas fan, that was a bad game. I did not like it.
No.
0-10.
Yeah. Anyway, we could talk about that. Ross, to you, what's some of the insight? Thank you, Katie, for that. That's we could almost do a whole podcast on that alone. Ross, to you, what's the insider baseball talk that you want to bring to the table today?
I'm going to circle back to some of the stuff that Katie was talking about. So please permit me to get on my soapbox for a moment and deliver my TED talk about big democratic data. I think we on the left over the years, and especially coming out of the Obama years, although I actually think we did a better job of this during the Obama years. But moving into 2016, data became a strategy. Data became the strategy. Data analytics became the strategy. And anyone who's ever had to use or implement data to make decisions knows that data is a part of decision making, that it is one input among many inputs into making decisions, and can often be very, very important inputs into decision making. And data does not have the ability to strategize and to reason and think, and can be interpreted in 100 different ways by 100 different people. And I think a thing that has happened on the left is, in an effort to try to control everything, we over-rely on data, and we use data to set strategy. There's the really the anecdote that people really like to use, and it's true, is that in Wisconsin in 2016, we stopped polling about 2 months before the election because we were relying solely on the models and analytics. And it turns out that the folks who were doing polling were actually seeing what was going on in Wisconsin in the moment. As someone who worked on the independent expenditure super PAC side, we did see movement in Wisconsin in polls. And we all assumed the campaign was doing polling and was seeing the same thing we were. We were incorrect in that assessment, we later learned. But and that's the easiest, most glaring example of of the way that it's worked, but I think when it comes to testing messages, when it comes to setting strategy, something that has happened this election cycle that I have never seen before on sort of like the super PAC side is usually the super PAC, and it used to be that the big presidential super PAC for years was Priorities USA. That was what it was called. There are plenty of things about Priorities to criticize in terms of what they did and what they didn't do. But what they did do is every cycle they would like set a strategy. Like they would do a ton of research. They would talk to people across the ecosystem before we couldn't coordinate anymore. Like, because in the United States, there's no coordination between like the big super PACs and the campaigns after a certain date. And they would set that strategy, and that's like what they would drive towards. And like, sure, they would have to make adjustments based on the research and like all that stuff. Yes. And this cycle, we did not do that. This cycle, we ran a bunch of numbers. And I mean, like, honestly, Katie got it exactly 100% right. Like, people send ads over and are like, we're really interested in like running this campaign, like with these ads. And they're like, okay, let's test them. And they test them and like, oh, these ads tested super well. We're going to like match the $10 million that you're putting in for this ad campaign. And we'll make this, this will go from like a $20 million ad buy to a $40 million ad buy in like these swing states because like the ads tested well. That's not a strategy. And I think it's really important to understand. I think after this election, we're going to need to have like a real conversation about what strategy actually looks like and what it doesn't look like. And, I think it will be a heated discussion on both sides, and it will probably largely depend on whether we win or not. But like, to be honest, we had this exact same conversation at the end of 2016. And here we are in 2024, basically doing the exact same thing that we did in 2016. And so, again, I don't know that I like have a ton of like faith that like it will change over time, but like I think that's sort of like the overlay I wanted to put on top because I'm not trying to raise any money from anybody or for any of these folks.
Before you move on to your next thing, I just want to say one thing, Ross, that opening stanza TED Talk you did there sounded very, very similar. Sticking with the Moneyball analogy, you sounded like the scout that got sacked by Billy Beane in Moneyball, who was anti-Bill James and the whole sabermetrics coming into baseball. You're like, no, it's about whether the guy's good looking, he's got a good looking girlfriend, or he's got a nice looking swing. That's why we're gonna choose him. It sounds like you're getting a bit old school there, Ross, and sort of pushing out.
I'm not. So I do have that sound to me, like a get off my lawn Clint Eastwood situation. So like I do admit that like that is as a character trait. I have a background in data analytics. Like I have a master's degree in analytics. Like I believe in using data. Like, I think it is really important. So I should say, I think it is really important. I think it is important to understand the limitations of data and analytics. And I think not enough people actually understand the interplay that exists between like human instinct, data and analytics. And if you look at now we're going to go like, I'm a baseball fan. Like, if you look at the teams that are the most successful, it's the ones that blend the analytics and sabermetrics stuff with like human insight, because there are still things that maybe we'll get to a place in 10 years where this isn't the case, but there are still things that humans can see that like the computer can't see. And again, that might change, but for right now, that's kind of where we still are.
Very good.
But yes, I point well taken.
What else are you seeing in terms of insider? This really is a baseball podcast now, isn't it? What else are you seeing in terms of inside the campaigns that you wanted to lift up today?
Well, I hope Katie's not a White Sox fan after they just had the worst season in Major League history.
I don't
No,
really
we're
watch a
not.
lot of baseball, so sorry. You're
That's
gonna lose me here. It is a
that's good.
good laugh line here though.
Um, the men folk, like the Trump campaign is going after them really hard, really aggressively, and it's just becoming clearer and clearer that like this is his like primary this is what the campaign sees as their primary path to victory. And they're relentlessly driving towards it, which I think is like really interesting. But it also demonstrates that like they basically know they're not going to win women. And they're just like leading all the way in. Donald Trump like took a swipe at White Dudes for Harris at the Al Smith dinner a couple of weeks ago. And for those who don't know what the Al Smith dinner is, it's organized by the Catholic Church in some way, shape, or form. It's a fundraiser. It's like it's a roast. And he told a joke about White Dudes for Harris, and I won't repeat it here, but you can go and watch. You can go and find it on the Googles. And if you watch, and then there was a CNN clip that I saw earlier in the week, it must have been Monday, that showed that Kamala Harris is doing a little bit better among non-college educated white men than either Clinton or Biden did. It's not by a ton, it's like 3 or 4 points, but in a razor thin election where, a place like Michigan or Wisconsin or Nevada, especially Nevada, might get decided by like 5,000 votes, like that actually does make a difference, or could make a difference, I should say. And I think that my hunch is that they're seeing some of that reflected in their internal polling as well. Is that like they're underperforming among white men, white college or white like non-college educated men. And then I saw a poll not too long ago that showed that Kamala Harris was ahead with college educated white men, which like if she wins college educated white men, that'd be like the first time in like, I don't know, decades that a Democrat has won college educated white men. I'm not buying. If you ask me if I'm buying or selling on that, I'm selling. I think we are closer than others. I think she is much closer, but I don't think she's going to win that demographic. But I think she'll come close. And, I think the Trump campaign has one path to victory, and it goes through men. If he cannot, and that has been the case for him. That was a little less the case in 2016, but that was also the case for him in 2020. And I know we'll get to this later. That's the thing that actually gives me a little bit of hope right now in this election. It makes me feel good is that like the last time this was his like path to victory, he wasn't able to pull it off. And I think the campaign knows it. It's a very narrow path. They have to do everything right. Do I think they are doing a lot of the things that they need to do? Yes. But I also think like the cartoonish sort of representations of masculinity that they've been doing are probably going to do more harm than good for him. I think like it works with his base, but I'm not sure it works with the people that they're trying to persuade to come out and vote. For example, like the Trump campaign posted after the Pittsburgh Steelers football game. I can't remember the Sunday. I think it was a Sunday night game. Like they posted a picture of like a super jacked Donald Trump that was like an AI image of him like in a Pittsburgh Steelers jersey. And it's just like it's pathetic, and it for sure resonates with a certain part of his base, and they need those people to come out and vote, and that's why they're doing that. But like if we're talking about backlash effect, I also think that there's like another crew of men that are like looking at that and being just like not even have a problem with it, but they're just like rolling their eyes, and are like, Jesus, like why? Like no, like you don't like stop, he's feeling like a try hard right now. and it will work with his base. I think there are questions about whether it will extend beyond his base, and I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical right now that it will. It could. I could be wrong, but I'm skeptical.
It's all very much too many eggs in the one basket kind of strategy that if I was a Republican, I'd be nervous about. But, you know, it's kind of
one path to victory is not what you want in a campaign.
It's as if they've said to themselves, it worked in 2016. Sure, it didn't work in 2020, but that was a weird election because it was a COVID election. So let's just roll out the 2016 campaign again. And we're running against a woman. So let's just replay that whole game.
But if you remember in 2016, there was an entire Ivanka strategy around women. You know, like she was out there like campaigning, talking to other white women, and like, you know, the New York Times sort of like, you know, did its little famous thing on the Ivanka voter, and that was stupid and made everybody sad and upset. But like that was an aggressive part of the strategy. And that was part of why, for example, like on debate night, Donald Trump like asked like a bunch of the women who accused Bill Clinton of stuff to come to the debate. Like that's who that was targeted at. It was targeted at young white women. That's like that was a whole strategy the campaign had. It's clear that if they thought that would work this time, they'd be doing it. But I think they're looking at the numbers and they're saying like, well, the abortion thing like really fucked us on this. And like, there's no path with these people.
Katie, before we move to our next section, any reflections on?
Yeah, I mean, I just keep thinking about like, that's such a great point about the Ivanka strategy. I completely forgot about her, and you know, because she's not around this time. She's not out there campaigning for him, and it's a big absence. Actually, we should talk more about on our side. But you know, the reason they're going after women is the same reason why we try to go after old people. They vote. I was looking back at the numbers just before this, and women consistently turn out 4 to 5 percentage points higher than men. Now, is that a huge number? No, but in a razor thin election, it matters. And, you know, you brought up backlash again, Ross, and I think that's exactly right. It seems like he's kind of stopped trying to appeal to women, or he's, if he is, he's playing the kind of protector role. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about this, that he's saying he'll, you know, women, you don't have to worry about democracy. We're here to protect you. It's not we're going to empower you or give you rights or make it possible for you to succeed. It's, you know, the big, strong men are going to take care of you. And I guess, you know, maybe they correctly think that it's only women who are interested in that who are likely to vote for him. But yeah, I think it's an interesting narrow path for him, like you said, Russ. Yeah, I'll be so interested to see what the turnout for women is this time, if it's, you know, significantly more even than typical.
And to back in your point, Katie, the figures coming out of the early voting numbers as well, not overwhelmingly, the majority of them are women. Yeah. High propensity voters are women.
Right. They're motivated.
Risky. All right. Let's go to our Swing State Spotlight segment, brought to you by Dunkin' Donuts. America runs on Dunkin's. Let's start off with Katie. I forced you to choose a state. Katie, you got Michigan, the Wolverine state, in our battleground state analysis. Over to you.
Yeah, well, so Michigan has 15 electoral college votes. Don't forget about those electoral college votes. So I think it's, is that second after Pennsylvania? Yeah. And like, as we will say for every single other state, it's a statistical tie. This is one where Harris is, you know, ever so slightly up. But it's still neck and neck there. And if you look back in 2020, the margin between Biden and Trump was 150,000 votes. So even in a pretty large state, it's I think around 10 million. You know, you're really coming down to a small number of votes. And also similar to Pennsylvania, this is, a more like Rust Belt type of state. Used to be a big center of manufacturing. Um, it's still known as a big union state, but just like everywhere else, those are kind of demographics that are starting to trend to the right. Um, let's see. The one difference here, I think it took a lot longer for Michigan to start to shift to the right. It was always a reliable blue state, and then 2016 went for Trump. So it'll be, I wonder if we're actually going to get back to a place where Michigan is a more reliable, even if it's still swingy. We would have to fight hard for it, but a more reliable Democratic state in the future, and maybe some indications of that. There's a Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who, if you're not paying attention to down ballot American politicians, she's a name to pay attention to. She very likely will run for president. I hope she does. She's fantastic. And in the 2022 cycle, you saw the whole state government switch party to be led by Democrats, really attributed in many ways to the abortion battle. And they very quickly started to pass policies to protect working people and women's access to healthcare. So there's just a good record for Democrats on the ground in Michigan. They've got a Senate race as well happening at the same time, which I think Ross talked about how helpful that is to boost turnout when you've got something like a governor or senator also on the ballot. And Alyssa Slotkin, who is the Democrat, is running about 5 points ahead of Harris, but also of her opponent. So we're looking relatively good there. The interesting thing about Michigan is really down to demographics. It's a pretty diverse state. 13% of the population is Black. It's a real college state. There's just a lot of colleges and college campuses that are there. So you get a lot of youth voters, and they had really high youth turnout in 2022. But the thing that everybody's focusing on, even though it's actually smaller than the Black population, is the very large Arab American population that is in Michigan. Or it's the largest of any other battleground state, though I think it's like 6th or 7th in the country. A lot of Arab Americans are feeling very, torn, essentially, about how to vote. So they went more like 60% for Democrats last time, but you're seeing a real dissolution of votes for Democrats from the Arab American population. And because the vote margin is so small in Michigan, there's been a lot of discussion about, is that actually going to be enough of a margin to shift? And it's also because you're seeing the people who talk about Israel-Palestine being an issue that they really care about. It's not just Arab Americans. It also tends to be Black people and young people, who are the other, large, interesting population groups there. Now, the one thing is that very few people list that as their top issue. I think in polling for the state overall, it was about 1% of voters who would indicate that as their, the main issue that they're voting on. But it's really salient, and it's certainly in the news a lot. It's in social media a lot, and people are feeling really conflicted. So that will be the thing to look for. Or I don't know if it's actually the most important, but it's the thing that everybody will be talking about as far as Michigan goes on election night and probably afterwards.
It is. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Because the numbers that what was the name of the campaign during the primaries against Biden was called that the Arab American Coalition ran.
Ross, do you remember? And I really should know this. But essentially, I don't remember what the name of it was, but they basically put uncommitted, or something like that.
That's what it's called.
Okay. If it's not that, it's something similar. So that was in the primary election. There was an organized effort to get Democrats to not vote for Joe Biden in the primary. Now, remember that this is when, there wasn't a serious primary, really, because Biden was the president and he was running, there was one other guy, I think, or maybe a couple of local folks who got their names on the primary ballot, but it was never a real consideration. But it was a protest vote and it was powerful. And, I think it was over 100,000 folks who voted uncommitted in Michigan, and that rippled out beyond Michigan as well. It's just that was the place where everybody really focused on it. So, there was a vocal contingent of folks among the delegates who were at the national convention in the party as well. There's been a really active group within the party who are trying to see some movement from the Biden administration, or to get Kamala to make a statement that's more strident, essentially, than just saying, "Oh, what a shame that we're slaughtering lots of people," or that Israel, our most important partner is. So that's sort of the history there of the uncommitted movement. That's right. Well, sorry, one other thing, just Michigan specific, that happened. I think this was last week. So Trump was in Detroit and talked shit about Detroit. he made some statement that, if Kamala Harris is elected, the rest of the country is going to look like Detroit. Now, he meant that as a diss, because Detroit famously, particularly 20, 30 years ago, it was, it was this massive manufacturing center that lost so much of the industry from car companies, either going offshore or just shrinking down because of automation. So Detroit was really built on the car industry, and there was a big hollowing out, lots of crime. Okay, but since then, actually, it's been this incredible revitalization story. So, it's kind of funny that you would say that, because, yeah, we all hope that the rest of the country will be like Detroit if Kamala wins. They've had incredible, boost in industry, and also just sort of different types of job drivers there. But the other thing, a friend of mine who lives in Michigan said, it's kind of like, even rural folks in Michigan don't want to hear you talk shit about Detroit. It's like a sibling, like, we can say bad stuff, but you can't say bad stuff. And so the Harris campaign has done a good job of making some funny little clips out of this and making hay.
That was an absolute slip up, which I'm glad that they're doubling down on. That was so bad, particularly because, I've been to Detroit. Downtown Detroit now is happening. Like, it's
gorgeous.
Thriving. Yeah, absolutely. Daytime and nighttime. And they're proud of it. Detroitians, or Michiganians, or whatever the hell they are. They're very, very proud of it. Michiganders, right. They're very proud of their city, and he went and talked shit when he arrived. What a moron. Anyway, all right, let's keep going. Thank you very much, Katie. Ross, let's turn to Wisconsin, the Badger State.
Yeah, so I think, like, a lot of the things that Katie said, like, it's basically a statistical tie. I think Harris and the 538 average is 47.9 and Trump is 47.5. There's a Senate election that's up in Wisconsin. So that's Tammy Baldwin. She's up by sort of like anywhere between 3 and 5 points in most of the real polls, not the like weird Republican polls that are getting thrown out there. There's 10 electoral college votes. It's a pretty white state. It's about like 83% white, about 6% Black, African American, like about 3% AAPI. So Wisconsin's a pretty white place. For a long time, similar to Michigan, it had just been trending Democratic at the national level. So I think, like, in 2016, a lot of people were surprised when we lost it. And for context, we lost that election in 2016 in Wisconsin by 23,000 votes. In 2020, Biden won it by 20,000 votes. And so it's going to be close. Like, any sort of, like, again, more is more, right? When you just, like, don't know, right? Like, any little thing could change the outcome and like swing 20,000 votes one way or another. The weather, uh, just like anything totally random. And there's like some of those things are in our control and the weather is not in our control. I'm not saying the weather is in our control. Democrats do not control the weather. To be honest, if Democrats control the weather, the fact that like we can't consistently win national elections is pretty fucking pitiful. If I'm just being totally honest, like if we could control the weather, then we should be able to win a presidential election every single year in the Electoral College, but that's neither here nor there. Wisconsin has one of the best sort of like party chairs in the country. Who his name's Ben Wickler. He's done a lot to like raise a ton of money for the state. He's rebuilt a lot of infrastructure that like had started to decay over many years, not because like people running the party were bad, but because like Scott Walker, who was a former Republican governor of the state of Wisconsin, like completely gutted organized labor, and organized labor had been the base sort of like of Wisconsin's like politics on the left for, like 100 years. And when he gutted it, it gutted our political infrastructure in the state. And so he's really undergone like a really significant project to like rebuild that infrastructure. And I think that's been really, really important in seeing some of the turnarounds that we've seen in the state. We have a Democratic governor. We have one Democratic senator. We probably should have two Democratic senators, to be totally honest. But like it has remained a pretty tight state for a long time. The thing that's really interesting about Wisconsin is it has sort of like a deep tradition of like progressive politics. Like a large part of like the progressive movement like comes from like the state of Wisconsin. And so like I think it's interesting because like Wisconsin is, I think a lot of people think of Wisconsin as a moderate state, but it's actually just it is very polarized. There are moderate pockets of Wisconsin for sure, especially like in a lot of the suburbs. But like there is a deep sort of like progressive tradition in the state that's really important to a lot of like left-leaning voters that live there. It's also just like there's not a ton of like huge cities in Wisconsin, like Milwaukee. You have Milwaukee, which like also has like a really cool, and like at some point like a deep dive on Milwaukee is always really fun because there's like a really interesting socialist tradition in Milwaukee. I think it was like the last city in America to have like a socialist, like major American city to have like basically be run by socialists. It was like it's a really interesting place. Madison, Wisconsin, which is the capital, also is like is a big university town. It's like a smaller version of Austin, Texas, and a lot colder for what it's worth. And like then there's like a lot of smaller towns like Green Bay and Eau Claire and places like that like most people have people might have heard of Green Bay because there's a US like football team there. But like I think that Katie talked about tipping point states sort of like last week in Pennsylvania, sort of like the number one tipping point state. Like across the Midwest, there's like people who will say it's like it could be Wisconsin, it could be Michigan, it could go one or the other. Like, to be honest, I'm not sure. I think either one of them is. I don't know that they're going to go together. I think we probably have a better shot in Michigan than Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin's just going to be close. It's a smaller state. There's fewer people, fewer electoral votes. But ultimately, like it's a part of what we've called in the past the blue wall. I don't think we should call it the blue wall because like it's too close for all these states that we like call the blue wall are way too close for comfort. and have been the last probably three or four presidential elections, I guess, like post Barack Obama. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. There is good infrastructure, there is good organizing work that happens there. The party is really good and has like really rebuilt itself over the years. But there's no way to know what's going to happen.
I think this is what's going to happen in all of these swing state analysis all the way up until the election day. It's so damn close. All right. Thank you, team. Let's move on to our sort of, I guess, our reflections, which is the things that red flags of the week, things that give you cause for concern. And then we'll end on a higher note, which is blue skies ahead. What gives you hope? But let's start with red flags of the week. What gives you cause for concern this week, Katie?
Yeah, I was thinking about. I think it's really hard to reach voters, and we know, personal conversations, face-to-face conversations, especially, and then phone calls, at least used to be the most effective way to connect with a voter. Persuade them if they're leaning, but get them over to your side, and then certainly to mobilize them. And there was a period of time, we really knew that during the Obama years, we did that really well. And then we got better at targeting and contacting people through social media. So we felt like, it's so much cheaper, right? If you can reach somebody just by targeting them with 35 ads, you don't have to build a massive field infrastructure and send out a bunch of volunteers. It's way easier. But targeting rules have changed. It's harder to find the people that we want to reach. There's also just such a glut of content that, people don't focus the way they used to, and it just doesn't have as big of an impact. And then it's nearly impossible to get somebody on their phone because of the way that phones are screening out junk calls these days. I don't know if it's that way in Australia, actually. Stephen, do you get
it's heading in that direction?
Yeah,
the best way to summarize it.
Yeah. No, fair enough. And then we moved to, we would text people. That's also now become. We still have to do it because you use all of the above when you don't know how you're going to reach people. But texting folks is not as effective as it was before, and that makes me nervous because that's how we turn people out. Now, at the same time, Trump's team is finally doing canvassing and campaigning. There was a lot of stories this week about that they've outsourced this to paid canvassing and had a lot of issues, or at least now public issues with falsified reports from the canvassers. So the folks who were paid to go out and knock doors all day, they get a list, and if you know how to game the system, whatever it is, it used to be paper, but now it's all digital. They can just kind of fake the answers and get through their list without actually talking to anybody. So, you'll find a report of somebody sitting in Taco Bell for half an hour instead of the 4 hours that it would have taken them to get through their walk pack, and magically all of the data is input. So, there's lots of kind of chuckling at the Trump team for outsourcing this part of their campaign, which on our side, we typically have a really large field operation. We certainly also have an apparatus of different organizations who do field organizing. So I'll just say, as much as it's funny to kind of laugh, they're also working with paid canvassing firms who, for the most part, have done this before. And I feel, I don't know, I tend to overestimate people's competence, which occasionally comes back to bite me. But I still tend to think that these groups that America PAC has hired have done this before and probably know that you have to factor in a certain amount of lying, a certain amount of, flubbing your data. And if they don't know that and they're doing this work and being paid millions of dollars for it, they deserve to fail.
Here, Ross, what's your red flag for this week?
There's it's not a red flag, but there's, I would say, an attitude I started to see among some of my political friends who are because this race is so close, because there's a lot of uneasiness about it, and that has people kind of like freaking out and sort of like chasing shadows a little bit. Like, there's this idea that like maybe the Trump campaign's actually playing 3D chess and we're just like over here playing checkers.
Mm.
I don't think that that's the case, and I don't think that his history bears that out. I don't think we have to worry about that. I think what we do have to worry about is the fact that like it's a 50-50 race. And I say this a lot. The number one way to tell if someone can get elected president of the United States is whether they've been elected president of the United States. And Donald Trump has been elected president of the United States. So he can win this election. And in a 50-50 race, it's just so tough. Like there's just so much unease, and it's not really specific, but like I would say there's definitely been a vibe shift and people are just like terrified. And for what it's worth, the glimmer of hope that lives in the vibe change is that like people whose like full-time jobs like aren't election related are like moving out to Pennsylvania and getting Airbnbs there with friends and spending all their time knocking on doors in Philadelphia and the Philly suburbs and like going out to Pittsburgh. So like that a lot of that has happened. I've seen a ton from folks that I know. So that's encouraging. I have another silver lining or whatever, or blue skies, but I think like the flip to everyone being freaked out is that it's actually getting people into action in a way that people didn't get into action in 2016. 2020, it's harder because it was the COVID election and people's risk tolerance was a little bit different and all that kind of stuff. So I think that it's easiest to compare it to 2016.
Let's stick with you, Ross, and you're starting to move into your blue skies ahead. So what's giving you hope for this week?
I think the stability of the race has actually giving me a little bit of hope. Like neither one of them are cratering, but we're not cratering, which is nice. I saw some headline that was like, the polls are like moving out of our direction. And then I like clicked and looked and it was like, oh, not really. Like they're still like, it's a dead heat everywhere. And the places where we weren't doing as well, we're still not doing as well, which is basically Arizona and Georgia. Yeah, I think the race is really stable. There aren't that many undecided voters. And it has been encouraging to see the sort of organizing and field click into gear in the last, like, I think yesterday or last episode, I said like field was worrying me. It still worries me, but like people are clicking into gear. Things are clicking into gear. Volunteers are going out. I'm getting like 100 emails a day from people being like, can you send this opportunity out to White Dudes for Harris? Like, people are like going on caravans to like Philadelphia. And, I got a bunch that are going from like LA to Nevada or LA to Phoenix. Like, I'm getting so many of those at this point, and that's all anecdotal. And, but like, it seems like the field operation is finally in gear. People are talking to voters. And like, at the end of the day, that's what you need to do in the last two. That's what makes a difference for us. And, I was about to say in the last 2 weeks, but like a thing that we often forget is that early voting starts like basically at the beginning of October, late September in some places. And so like voting has been happening in a lot of places for a while. So like, it is the last 2 weeks of the election, but like a lot of people have already cast their votes. I have my absentee ballot sitting right over here. I haven't voted yet, but I'm gonna, it's on my list of things to do this week to fill out my ballot. And, in DC, you can take it to a Dropbox location, and there's a Dropbox location like 2 blocks from where I live. So I'm going to walk it down there because I'm sure I'll get really busy on election day. And even though I love to vote on election day, There is one election in particular that I don't feel super proud of, where I actually got too busy to vote, and that wasn't good. I live in DC, so like in the general election in November in DC, there's basically nothing. There's very few things that are competitive on the ballot. There's actually some ballot measures this cycle that I'm like excited to vote for. But like that year, there wasn't a ton on the ballot that was going to be substantial. And, DC goes Democrat at like 90%. So it wasn't the end of the world, but, I'm not super proud of it.
To add to your field clicking into gear anecdote, I went on because I'm heading to Detroit next week, I went on the Michigan volunteer website, filled out a form, and then I got an email from the out-of-state field director to set up a Zoom call and a one-on-one, and we met, and then she's organised for me to go onto canvassing in a particular area where I'm staying. And I just thought that was quite remarkable that someone would actually bother to reach out to someone who's not even from. I mean, I get her job is out-of-state director. She's supposed to help mobilise folks from out of state, but to take a call from Australia and make the effort to find the time was, remarkable. So I thought that leaving no stone unturned was my takeaway from what's still happening in Michigan. Sarah, lovely person. Shout out to her. Hope she does well. Okay, Katie, can we get your blue skies ahead before we close it out for today's episode?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty similar. I was thinking about this earlier, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I really have one, but I think that's just because it's so tight, right? But if I think about it further, I'm really glad this time we don't, as a party, as a whole, seem overconfident this time. Everybody's got their nose to the grindstone. Everybody's running hard to the end, whatever anecdote or metaphor you can throw at it. We're really working hard. And I think, in 2016, it felt like we were overconfident. As a person with family in Indiana, like I just, people completely dismiss Trump in a way that we are not doing this time. And the Republicans are kind of acting like they've got this wrapped up in a lot of ways, at least in their messaging. Now, I think it's again because they're trying this bandwagon effect, but they're doing the same things that they did in 2022. They've started releasing some junk polls. There was a lot of that last week, I think in Georgia, but it's it didn't work for them last cycle. And I'm just hoping that that's an indicator that our hard work will pay off.
Here. Sorry, there is one more thing we need to do because we didn't do it last week, but we need to do it this week. It's Katie's turn to summarize. I don't know how I said top 3 craziest things Trump said this week. Very difficult to get it into 3. I appreciate that, but I think we've already touched on one. But let's get the top 3.
Yeah, the top of the list for me was the whole McDonald's stunt. So we've checked that box. The other one, wait, let me see. I did have to write these down. Oh, the Arnold Palmer thing. So Trump was at an event in Arnold Palmer, famous golfer, in his hometown, and started, as he just kind of rambled and went on about how wonderful Arnold Palmer is, up to the point of talking about his large physical endowment in front of a crowd. I mean, it's just nuts. Completely apropos of nothing in that speech. And now I think Arnold Palmer's family has come out and criticized him for this, and I don't know. So that's one. The other one is earlier this week, he called himself the father of IVF, which is hilarious. I mean, so for folks who maybe didn't follow this as closely, earlier this year, I think it was in Alabama that this happened. The state passed a law, because it's a very conservative state. They passed a law that would essentially make IVF illegal, and everybody was in a huge uproar about this, even Republicans. It got quickly overturned. And because Trump is so bad on the abortion issue, he's trying to, claw back some relevance on reproductive health. And so he's now, saying that he saved IVF because of his interventions in Alabama. But I mean, he's why we're in this mess in the first place with Roe. So pretty funny.
He this week he's gone kind of blue. In terms of, like, he's got a bit of a potty mouth at the moment in a lot of the rallies and his public appearances. The Arnold Palmer stuff was one thing, and then he started just saying really disparaging things about a host of different Democratic identities, but really blue and off color. And I just sort of, and there's kids in the rallies. If I was a Republican parent, I'd be like, mate, tone down the S-bombs and calling people pigs and all this sort of stuff. Don't know, odd. Off color. All right. Thank you so much to our two special guests for today. Don't forget, if you are in the United States listening to this show, as both of them have said, go out and knock doors. That's all we've got left to do. And in the show notes today, there's a link to where you can volunteer in your local neighborhood. So click on that and do that. Don't forget our next week, we've got 2 episodes. We'll get our post-Queensland election state recap with Jackie Trad and Evan Moorhead. That'll be up probably midweek. And then obviously we've got our last pre-election episode with Katie and with Ross, which I'll be recording on US time because I'll be over there now. So that will be just as nervous as this episode is leading into this poll, because we'll be in the final week of the campaign. Ross, Katie, thank you so much for your time again today. Really appreciate it. I know we keep on saying we're going to do an hour and we keep on going over time, but because there's just so much to talk about. But they're great episodes, and I look forward to seeing you both stateside in a week's time.
Thanks
for having us.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.